Hello! So today we're going to be painting some pink flowers with watercolor. So I already have these sketched out onto a piece of Arches cold press paper, but if you're curious how to draw the flowers in the first place, one thing I want to look at first is a lot of times when I'm looking at flowers, I want to look at the radius, the flowers, like the whole entire, circular space of the flower. So I'm looking at like the widest part to the tallest part. So that helps me to kind of make sure I'm making my petals, big enough and they're fitting in the same area. And also with these, the other flower is a little bit smaller. And then I find where the center of the flowers are just very lightly. You don't want to, draw too dark. And I would probably recommend drawing this on a separate piece of paper and transferring it rather than drawing straight onto the watercolor paper, unless you're going to keep the drawing pretty simple. And then after that, I want to count how many petals I have. And I'm very lightly going to kind of do a very simplistic shape for my petals. So it's going to look kind of like, cute little daisy shapes at first. So now these are a little trickier because they get kind of cut off. And then after you have those simple shapes, then I want to start looking at the negative space and kind of the different angles that these petals have. So like this petal has these fun little curves right here in little divots. And I want to look at how it leads me to the center. And you do want to note how there is another circle inside, well, on the outside of our center. So circle outside. So I'm going to make sure I'm leaving room for that. And then I'm going to angle up this flower. And that's how I would work on your petals, and just take your time with those. And then of course, the middle part, I could just do the outline of all those little pollen areas like that. So you can see how I transferred my drawing later on, and it's, a little simplified. So just having these little wavy bits on there and the overall idea of our petals. And then the next step is we're gonna get started painting. So I wanna make sure I have a nice big round brush for when we're doing, big kind of like washes or the background eventually. And then I have a slightly smaller brush. So this one is a size 4, but that just depends what brand you're using, kind of relative size. So you can kind of see the difference between the two. This one's a size 10. And then I have a couple detail brushes. So you just want to make sure, they're pretty soft brushes. They're not too stiff. If I was going to be doing lifting at all, then I would want a stiff brush. But most of the time, the Magenta brushes and the Royal, these are mostly for acrylic, but they're great for watercolor too. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to use some lemon yellow. And lemon yellow could also be called like cadmium yellow light. It's just a really nice bright yellow. So I'm going to take some of that. I'm cleaning off my palette first. So sometimes if you notice your palette has gotten a little messy, you can always rinse a little water all over it. Or sometimes I'll take a wet paintbrush and just kind of scrub the layer off and then dab it with a paper towel. So that's why it's important to clean your brush in between when you're mixing colors so you don't end up with this, issue. So I'm going to take some yellow, that lemony yellow, add a decent amount of water to it. Oops, I don't know if y'all can see that. So a little bit more water. The more water with watercolor, the lighter it's going to look. And then I'm going to go ahead and fill in the center of my flower with that yellow. And while it's wet, I could actually take a tiny bit of a color called Viridian Green. So Viridian Green is a little bit of a cooler green. Looks like that. So if I take a little bit of that, add it to my lemon yellow, it's going to make it just slightly greener. And while it's wet, I'm just going to come in and tap. And it's wet enough that these taps aren't going to disappear completely. And then I may have to take kind of a wet brush and dab in between the colors. And what this is doing is making a shadow at like the bottom of the center. And I'm going to do the same thing for my second flower. I'm just wetting the whole thing with my yellow. I haven't pre-wet the paper at all. And then I'm going to take my Viridian Green and dab it in while it's wet. Kind of like polka dots, but very gentle. And that'll give it a little bit of texture also. So if I had wanted to do this step at the end, I would have masked off the center and then come back in and done this, but I'm trying to avoid masking fluid with this project, so that's why I haven't done that. So, and then next, what we want to do is, since we have to wait for some things to dry, it's good to kind of bop around with watercolors. So like I'm going to go ahead and do a light coat on my stems while these are drying. So our stems are green, but a lot of times it's important to look at what kind of green is in a picture. So like this green is more of a yellowy green, so probably sap green with lemon yellow would make a nice green, versus the green of the stems is a little bit of a cooler green, so has more blue, but it's also toned down. So I could take, let's see, my lemon yellow, add some ultramarine blue or cobalt blue. They're basically, I mean, they're pretty darn close. Wouldn't say they're the same thing, but they're close. A little bit of ultramarine blue, and that's going to help us to make our own green. So you can already see it's a nice bluey green compared to that green. And then it's a little bright for me, so I'm going to tone it down with a little red. So red and green are complements where they're across the color wheel. So that tells me that they will help to tone each other down. So I'm going to take a little bit of red and mix it into the green. And now I'm going to do a really light coat on my stem. So then instead of just ending it right there, I'm going to fade it with a little bit of water. So now that my center is fairly dry, I'm going to go ahead and now start working on these little bits right here that are kind of a warmer yellow. So the reason why I'm painting these first instead of our petals is because our petals are kind of a darker color rather than the center. The center is a little bit more yellow and lighter, and that color is harder to put on top of darker colors. So I'm going to take a warmer yellow, such as this color. And I'm going to add maybe a little bit of orange to make it warmer. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill in the edges over here, and you can kind of see there's a white space in between the little center and here. So I'm trying to leave that space fairly empty, and I'm just kind of almost polka dotting these in here. Like that. And I'll do the same thing on my other one. And then once this is dry, I can give it a little more depth by doing another layer, but we'll have to wait for that. Or maybe we'll just wait a second. So while we're waiting, I could always take, maybe more green and darken my center just a little bit, but we don't want our center to get too much darker. And then next what I could do is to add depth, I could either layer with that same color, just more of that color, or I could add more orange to my little center things. Like that. Just by doing another little layer. So, and if they were too orange, I could always take a little water on my brush and kind of tap to blend them a bit. But if used too much, it's all going to become flat. So, and if I wanted to brighten up my stems, I could always take a little yellow and glaze on top of them. So that's where you use a really, really light layer on a color. So that means, you know, lots of water, very little color. And if you just glaze on top of a color, it changes it just slightly. So since my centers are now dry, I'm gonna start adding some little lines in here to kind of separate these white bits. So if you look, it's actually the petal color that's helping to separate those. So that kind of pink you could make with alizarin crimson, really watered down. Or you could use a color called quinacrine magenta. That's a really great pink color, but alizarin crimson is still great. So I'm going to use just a little bit of that pink with a very small detail brush. And I'm just going to very lightly draw some little lines to help to separate the little white parts. Not everywhere, but in some small areas. Okay, and then I'll come back later and put more of those, or even use gray. So now whenever you're painting petals on a flower, there's a couple different techniques you can use. And I'm just making sure to prepare a good amount of pink. They are a little purple too, so I could add a little ultramarine blue to make them more purple, like that. So one way you can paint a flower petal is I can take water, just clean water, and put it in a place where I don't want to have, you know, very much pink, or I just want things to get softer. And then I can fill all of this area. And then I'll slowly drag it down. So see how I'm dragging that pink down, and this is going to create kind of the feeling of veins. You could also take a paintbrush and lift little veins, but it doesn't seem to get the same effect. I enjoy the other technique a little bit more. And then I could always drop in a little bit more pink while it's wet. And kind of tease the area with a little bit of water. And painting flower petals, you know, takes a bit of time, takes a bit of practice, so it's okay if your first one isn't perfect. So, and then I'm going to skip one, because if I did all my petals next to each other, they're all going to kind of blend in. So let's try that again, where I'm going to wet my petal. I'm going to take my pink, And this time I did more water, so you can kind of see how the edges are getting really fuzzy. And I'm kind of outlining around my center, and I'm trying to curve into the white. And on this one, we do a little water and some pink. And then for this one, I can again, you know, kind of go in between to create those veins. Like that. Another way you can do it is you could actually wet the whole entire petal. And then everything's going to be really soft. And the thing with flower petals is they're so loose, you kind of have to let them dry, let them do their own thing. Because if we try and nitpick or edit them a lot, sometimes we lose just the natural fun and randomness they can do. Okay, so since this one's still wet, I'm going to skip over to this one. And this one, I'm going to show you how to do lifting. So instead of wetting my paper, I'm going to come in with just the pink. So it's all pink. And then I'll take a nice firm brush with a little bit of water. I like to turn mine a little bit, and I'm going to lift like that. So it doesn't give you the same, you know, fun effect as a wet on wet, but it's still kind of fun by itself. And I'll take a little purple, oops, drop it in on the edge. You can also re-wet an area. And bring some darker colors back in. Now we're going to do some more pink. This one coming with pink. And then maybe just fade it using water. So that's where I'm just using straight paint at first, like that. And then just using a little water so it gets lighter as you go up to the top. And then while it's wet, again, you can kind of drop in some dark values and just let it sit there. And watercolor is all about layers. And then I'm just gonna let that dry, and then I'll talk about the back. My flowers are dry. I can go ahead and get started on my background. So for the background, I'm just gonna do lots of different greens. So on my palette, I wanna make sure to prepare a nice puddle of greens. So if you have pre-mixed greens, that's totally fine. You could just use those. A lot of times pre-mixed greens sometimes aren't the right color. Like sometimes sap green is just too yellow. But I can always add colors to it. Like I'll add a little blue. Whoa, that's a lot of blue. But that's okay. I'll add a little red to make it, maybe this will be my darker green. And then I'm gonna make a yellowy green. So, a lot of times with backgrounds, I like to do them in sections. Oops, well, this is supposedly clean water. As you can tell, it's slightly green. But I would wet each section first rather than trying to paint the whole entire background at the same time. And this just helps, you know, my background to stay a little consistent, and then I won't have any hard edges. So I'm gonna wet a little bit farther than I'm actually gonna paint. I'm going to take my yellowy green, and I'm kind of using the side of the tip to drop in those colors. And what's nice about this brush is it has a little bit of a tip, so I can go around my flowers pretty well. Like that. And I'm just dropping in some green. And then, while it's wet, I can use a technique called salting. Real quick, I'm gonna make it a little darker right next to the stem so the stem pops up. I could also have done like a lighter background near the stem since the stem is kind of dark. But either way, I can take a little bit of salt while it's wet and sprinkle it into my background, and that'll create some texture. And then now I'm going to continue wetting the paper. A little bit of water. A little bit of greens. And typically if you were doing like a really big picture, you would want to tape off your paper so you wouldn't get warping. That's why my paper is kind of moving a little bit and starting to pucker up. That's all due to not taping the paper. Because you know, when you get a lot of water in an area, that's what happens. I'm gonna sprinkle a little bit of salt. Just go around. You can still drop in color while you have salt on the paper. You just want to be careful not to touch it too much, or else it'll ruin the salt effect. And I'm just fading the edges with a little water. If you get a little bit on your flowers, it's okay. Once it's dry, I can try and take a brush with a little water and lift some of that off, but if I try it while it's dry, I could accidentally drag more of the background color into my flowers. And do a little more salt. Really just takes a little bit. And of course, you didn't have to do the background with greens. I could also have dropped in like some pinks to kind of represent far away flowers. You just have to be careful with, you know, pink and green are like complements, so they're going to make a little bit of brown. So if you don't mind that, that's totally fine. Oops, that's okay. If that happens, I can always just embrace it and make it the same on either side, or I can take my paintbrush and lift my stem out. And then probably the last little things is I could add more shadows into my flowers, more little details. Kind of a gray, I could go underneath a little pollen, do a little shadow, and like that. And there you go. So that's kind of a simplistic way of how to paint some little flowers. Obviously you want to take your time, and layers are very important.